Well, welcome all. It is noon here in Chicago, so we are going to get started with our conversation with Graham School instructor Jennifer Lind on her upcoming course, Exploring Great Power Politics, through a book that many of us love, The English Patient. We are going to be talking with her about how this book gives insight into broader ways of looking at international relations, which is a topic that we are trying to engage more as a school. And that is why instructors like Jennifer have been so incredible as partners as we continue to add to the resources of the Graham School. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Graham School and on behalf of the university. And I'll just say that it is a gorgeous, if the trees have slightly less leaves on it today, day at the university. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, we are the home of lifelong learning for more than 130 years. We have a number of different ways that you can engage with our universe, from a deeply rigorous Master of Liberal Arts all the way over to annual programs where you can look at topics ranging from knowing Chicago to the future of museum publishing. But the reason that you are here today is to talk with a Graham School instructor who is both deeply involved in the world of international relations as someone who has studied this and who has looked at these topics across her life, as well as someone who really deeply reads novels and literature and has brought those together in a really exciting course that you will hear more about. Jennifer Lind holds a master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, as well as a Master of Liberal Arts from the University of Chicago. She subsequently worked after SAIS for the US State Department and USAID in DC, the former Yugoslavia, and several sub-Saharan African countries. We are very proud to have her as an instructor and grateful for her many forms of leadership, including civic leadership across Chicago and leadership here at the Graham School more broadly. Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you to everyone who signed in. It's wonderful to see here in the chat people coming in from throughout the country, and indeed quite a few foreign countries as well. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Seth.
Well, so Jennifer, this is your second class where you are exploring international relations through literature. And I'm curious if we could just start with why you think that international relations can be understood through novels. And then maybe we can just end this particular question with why The English Patient as a novel in particular.
Sure. Well, for me, I would say marrying novels and fiction with international relations comes naturally. I think maybe it makes sense first, though, to just remind ourselves what international relations, what as a field, what that is. And I would say international relations, it's really the essence of it, the core of the field of study is really theory. We have to think the idea of international relations, of course, is to study how states, how countries, how nation states interact with each other. And all of these disparate facts, all of these experiences, all of these decisions, to organize them, to understand them, we use international relations theories as tools really to understand what international relations really means. And those theories, they're really two essential, it's like a three-legged stool, international relations, with two essential theories that are hallmarks of the field. And the first is realism, which is essentially realpolitik, right? It prioritizes security above all else in this anarchic world, right? There's no international higher authority. So states need to sort of be in charge of their own security. And that's realism. And the second leg of the stool in terms of international relations theory is liberalism, which of course that lowercase l, that doesn't mean, it doesn't refer to in a US domestic sense, the capital D Democrat or progressive. It doesn't mean that. It means liberal idealism, liberal internationalism, the idea that security alone is not the priority, but rather it looks at things like democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies don't go to war, or a term used before World War I, that economic intercourse, the idea that when states are tied with their economic trade, they won't go to war. Or liberal institutionalism, the idea that we could set up institutions like the League of Nations or the United Nations to make states responsible stakeholders that would follow the rules. That's sort of the heart of liberalism. So those two theories of course, constantly compete with each other, but they help us look look at this incredibly complex, complicated world we live in, to organize those facts and to understand how it is that our world works. But those two theories have to be absolutely wrapped up with a huge bow in the other ism, as Dean Boyer at the University of Chicago likes to talk about the great isms, and that is nationalism. And that is just the most powerful force on the planet, it's often said, this sort of persistent human tendency to group ourselves, right, with others based on sort of a territorial community. And that nationalism is, of course, many times a force for good and others a force for war. And we'll look at nationalism through the novel, The English Patient.
Right, and I imagine that's why you chose this novel. And so, I mean, jumping into the novel itself, Jennifer, and I want to maybe not presume everyone in the room knows the contents. And so we'll maybe lay out a little bit of the storyline and then we'll jump into the relationship with IR. And so before we go further, can you just give everyone here a high-level snapshot of the storyline of The English Patient?
Sure. This novel that was published in 1992. It's a Booker Prize winner. The English Patient, the novel, it joins a list of novels written about and in response to both world wars and the interwar years. And The English Patient is unusual because it is a war novel. It's a World War II war novel, yet it bypasses sort of the traditional references and studies of the Western Front or D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the Holocaust. We don't see any of that. Its subjects are rather the reordering of the post-war world, and kind of through the reordering of the lives of our four protagonists in this novel. It's as though the subject of the novel is the after effects of this war. This novel it's framed really by looking at a non-Western or an international context at World War II, kind of exposing the post-World War II order, this colonial structure that rests behind the order, into the Western sort of 20th century great power politics. It's the high-level summary is The English Patient takes place during the Northern African campaign towards the end of the second half of World War II and towards the last 6 months of World War II in Northern Italy. There are 4 damaged people who are damaged by the war, even if they haven't seen combat. They're not soldiers. And they're holed up in an abandoned villa outside of Florence in Tuscany. And they're sort of getting to know each other and reordering their lives as the war comes to a close. That's sort of a very high level summary.
And before we jump into those characters in The English Patient, maybe you could share a little bit, as far as you know, why the author wrote The English Patient in 1992 and what insights into the author's life or background maybe inform how the piece is actually written.
Sure. Thank you. And that's a very important question to me to really take time, and we'll certainly do deep dives into this during our class in the winter quarter. Anything I read, any piece in a newspaper or a novel, anything, we want to really take a moment to consider the author, right? When it was written and who wrote it and the perspective of the author. Well, Michael Ondaatje is the author of this novel. It was published in 1992. He's Canadian. He wrote this novel from 1985 to 1992 is when he worked on it. He's published more poetry than novels, by the way. He considers himself a poet novelist. But during this time in Canada, in Toronto, where he lived, there was widespread debate in Canada, throughout Canada, about nationalism, about integration, about immigration. And one example he will cite is that weighed on him while he wrote this novel is that in Canada, for example, Sikhs were in public life were discouraged from wearing their turbans. That's a tangible sort of image of something that was on his mind when he was writing this novel. And of course, it's this novel about World War II. So this is on his mind in the 1990s when he's writing the novel. He's writing about, and you can read many of his interviews, Michael Ondaatje, his concern was about the dangers of nationalism. And he's looking at it in a historic perspective, how individuals can kind of free themselves from this imposition of nationalism, how we can benefit from the positive characteristics of nationalism, but how we can sort of free ourselves from the dangers of nationalism. These tensions between, and Canada is an excellent example, these tensions between regional identity and national identity. You know, do they, we think of Canada and the Quebecois, you can think of the Basque in Spain and France. Are regional identities and national identities a braid that can support each other, or are they a tug of war, you know, that are at odds with each other still today? So Michael Ondaatje, he was born in 1943. He's 80 years old. He was born in what is now Sri Lanka. He was born in colonial Ceylon. He's of Dutch, Tamil, Sinhalese descent. His parents were tea planters in what is now Sri Lanka. And then at the age of 11, he was shipped off himself to England, where he studied through the end of high school. And then he went to university in Canada, where he settled as a poet and an author. And I would just add one more thing about our author. I'm reading about him and learning more about him. He often refers to one French historian who had the most profound influence on him in his writing. And that French historian's name is John Berger. And he quotes him and he says, quote, "Never again will a story be told as if there were only one," end quote. So Michael Ondaatje, and through The English Patient, we can see that idea of telling a story from multiple perspectives, that can definitely be a political statement. Well, it's just as much an artistic statement. And The English Patient is telling the story, not just of the end of World War II, but of war and the destructiveness of war through various different perspectives.
Well, so let's jump into those perspectives, Jennifer. And it was worth starting maybe with the name of the book, The English Patient. And so let's talk about, you know, who is this English patient in the story? Why is he nicknamed the English patient? And maybe most of all, you talked about the isms earlier, and nationalism plays a very profound role in this book. You know, how do forces of nationalism shape this English patient and his life?
Well, sure. Well, luckily we have an entire quarter to dive deep into all of this, right? Well, so indeed, the English patient is a nickname. All we know about him is he's nameless. He's at the center of our story. He's like a blank screen, really, that the other characters sort of, their life experiences are sort of projected onto him as a screen. He's nicknamed the English patient because he speaks English. He speaks an educated, eloquent, worldly English, and he's cared for by a young Canadian nurse. So that's really all we know of him. He's badly burned. He was rescued by the Bedouins in North Africa in the late 30s in a plane crash. There's a lot of religious imagery around him. He was anointed with oil by the Bedouins, so what we know about him is he was saved by the Bedouins. He was eventually brought through, because the Allies pushed the Germans out of North Africa pretty quickly, but it took years to push the Germans north out of Italy, out of mountainous Italy. And he finds his way into a hospital in Rome and then eventually in Tuscany in this villa where he's cared for by a Canadian nurse. Who he is, his life experiences, how he ended up crashing in an airplane in the Sahara and being burned head to toe, that will slowly come out through the other characters, prodding him to share his stories through his memories, sort of in a non-linear fashion throughout the novel.
Well, so we'll leave him for the moment on the table. And I'm curious to put out one more character, Jennifer. Kip is another character. He's from India. He's working to defuse bombs with the British forces in the Second World War. Can you tell us about him and what his character might illuminate?
Sure. Kip is one of the 4 characters who end up spending the last several months of World War II together in this abandoned villa. It used to be a nunnery, and then it was an Allied military hospital before it was abandoned. So Kip was raised in India. He's Sikh, and he was sent to England for his education because he was raised in the British Empire, right? He's a subject of the crown. He was selected as a strong student to be trained by the British military in London to become a bomb, they called it a sapper, a soldier who defuses bombs. So he was raised in colonial in the British Empire in India, educated in England, and serves in the British military. And I don't want to do too much spoiler alert, but he essentially leaves London where he's trained, and we find out this nuggets of everyone's stories in a non-linear way throughout the novel. But he's one of the top 10 sappers, is what they call it, bomb diffusers in Great Britain, in the British military. And so he's trained in these special forces. And he chooses to essentially escape his situation in England to volunteer to go to Italy. He's not, he's respected by his military comrades, his peers, by saving their lives because he can defuse bombs better than most, his calm, cool personality, but he's not respected outside of work, right? Like at the pub, they won't talk to him. So that it brings in all these different themes of sort of prejudice and colonialism that Kip brings into it. He finds his way to the villa where he and the Canadian nurse Hannah and the English patient and another Canadian who ends up at the villa, they all spend these last 6 months sort of getting to know each other, getting to know themselves as the war comes to a close. Kip is a crucial part of this story because the novel ends abruptly. The novel ends when Kip hears on the radio this gentleman who has spent his adult life defusing bombs to save hundreds or thousands of Allied lives. When he hears the news August 6th and August 9th, 1945, of the Allies dropping the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the novel ends abruptly right after that. So there's so much to unpack there, and Kip is really a crucial character.
And as you have reflected on that, that's a really, I guess, intriguing ending, because here he is diffusing bombs. The story's ending with that diffusing of bombs, that side dropping bombs, in a major way.
Right.
How do you think that shapes the way that you understand international relations? Like, how would reading that potentially, and maybe just to take you as an example, Jennifer, how does that, lead to reflection on your end that might be different than what you're doing just in a typical IR class?
Well, sort of my immediate reaction, it's certainly in a typical IR class, is you realize how the world, the great power politics, the status quo of the international world order changes suddenly, right?
Right.
August 6th and August 9th, 1945, it's a different world. The world changed completely. And you could see how decisions by small groups of people can have global effects for decades, if not longer, right? And it is appropriate to leave time for current events in these sorts of classes, right? And we can look at, for example, October 7th, right, this year, how the status quo never holds forever. That's what I would say about the end of this book. And it's abrupt on purpose, right? As a reader, you're left sort of super uncomfortable. But to look at it through literature, literature is sort of this tool, rather than a typical IR class where we're reading all nonfiction, right? We're reading Thucydides and Machiavelli and E.H. Carr. But through literature, it gives us this opportunity it challenges us, it invites us to consider all the different factors that went into these decisions, and the policy makers, to look at Truman, to look at his life. How is it that these decisions were made, first of all? And second of all, one thing I just love using literature, it really echoes, it's a French name, it's called the Annales School of History, of historiography, of teaching history from the bottom up, to look at everyday people's lives, not just to study sort of emperors and military successes and military battles or presidents or leaders, but to study both the lives of leaders and also of everyday people, such as these 4 damaged young and middle-aged people in northern Italy, how international events such as atomic weapons, how that affects everyday lives, how everyday people's lives are changed, and the decisions that go into sort of from every level of how these international events actually affect real people. And literature really offers us that opportunity.
Well, Jennifer, you made a passing reference, but I want to draw it out further, that in the course, you will read The English Patient. You'll also read some complementary texts that are actually coming from the IR field. And I've seen your syllabus. I'm thinking of Max Weber. I'm thinking of Benedict Anderson. I'm thinking of E.H. Carr. Can you just talk a little bit about those texts and how you'll have this interplay between a novel and then these IR theories and how each will inform the other?
Yes, absolutely. So again, I started out teaching nonfiction the last years, but this year, for the first time, we're using fiction. So I am an IR gal at heart, right? I'm not a sort of literature hasn't been my focus, although I'm embracing it and loving it. Yet when we do look at literature, it helps us to frame it with some international relations theory, right? And so, and I bought this 10 years ago. This is a reader on nationalism, and it's on the syllabus. And it gives us that framework, right, that we can discuss the events of these imagined events, the imagined characters. We want to discuss them in both a historical and a theoretical framework. So this is a selection of writers and scholars who write on nationalism, so that the first 2 weeks of the quarter, we'll read some of this nonfiction. Then the bulk of the quarter will look at our novel, a deep dive, close reading, close analysis at the novel, and then wrap up with some more theory at the end. And just to name a few, since I did mention E.H. Carr, he, of course, is most famous for his book, The 20 Years as Crisis, which was published in September 1939 and sought to explain that 20 years crisis. E.H. Carr, he was British. He was a diplomat. He was a young diplomat at Versailles in one of his first overseas assignments. But when he writes on nationalism, he talks about 3 phases of nationalism. Essentially, before the Napoleonic Wars is the first phase, sort of beginning, ending with sort of the U.S. Revolution and the French Revolution. That's nationalism, right? That's self-determination. But the middle phase he talks about is the 100 years after the Napoleonic Wars, which was basically France against the world, from 1815 to 1914, where nations and national identities really took off, really went supernova, right? Countries even had personalities. Uncle Sam, or in France, Marianne. This idea of sort of nationalism really taking hold is that second phase. And then E.H. Carr writes about this third phase of nationalism after World War I. So E.H. Carr is one person we'll look at. We'll look at several. Benedict Anderson wrote a very famous book called Imagined Communities. We'll look at some of his writing. And he basically, he says, he emphasizes it's a socially constructed concept, the idea of a nation and nationalism, that we've imagined communities. How else can we share territory, right? We might share nothing else. Imagine your own very own next door neighbors. You may or may not be friends. You may or may not even like each other. But one thing you share for sure in common is hopefully we all try to get along, and hopefully we're friendly with all of our neighbors. But one thing we share for sure, even just your immediate neighbors, you live on the same street or in the same building. Well, that's the idea of imagined communities. Think of 13 disparate colonies, right? Spread out along the Atlantic seaboard in 1783 with really, and they didn't like each other. They didn't want to share a dime or a militiaman with each other. The only thing they really had in common is they were subjects of the British crown and they didn't want to be anymore, right? So they had to come up with an imagined community. George Washington called it the cement of interest. How do we create a nation? So we'll look at some of that historical and theoretical framework through some just a bit of nonfiction to frame our class.
Well, so I have one more question, then we're going to turn to everyone else. So please start chatting in your questions for Jennifer. Jennifer, you just completed a class where you were harnessing the power of novels to look at international relations. And I believe you just actually screened and then read through the remains of the day. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about, how that reading and course really raised a lot of these IR issues and how you saw that play out in the classroom.
Sure. Right. So this past autumn, I taught a course on, it was on classic international relations through the 2 novels, Eric Maria Remarque's 1928 novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, and Kazuo Ishiguro's novel. He's a Nobel laureate for his novel that was published in 1989, The Remains of the Day. And just in the interest of time, I'll speak to The Remains of the Day. And I did, by popular demand, I did host movie nights for both films because we are studying the novels. And we work hard to set aside films, TV shows, our past careers, our past travel, and really focus our attention on the words on the page, right, in our courses. And on the but we did enjoy very much the movie nights. The Remains of the Day is an ideal novel to study international relations and international relations theories. It is a butler. Well, first of all, one must focus on the prologue in The Remains of the Day. The first word and the first two words there on the first page the author gives us is July 1956. That is when, that marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire. That is when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. That was and then of course, October, November, President Eisenhower called Prime Minister Anthony Eden and said, go home, stand down, we're in charge. That was the New World Order. The British Empire was the last of the European empires to fall. The US and the Soviets were in charge of a bipolar world. So in that novel, taking place in July, it's a 6-day motoring trip that a butler who is reminiscing about his service in the 30s to British establishment aristocratic Nazi sympathizers. And he's reckoning with his service to Nazi appeasers. And he is remembering, and so it's remembering the 30s, and he now works for an American employer, which is it's about the fall of the British Empire as it relates to the rise of the US as a great power. And he's reminiscing on his former employer's admiration for strongmen. He refers to Roosevelt twice, and I shared in our Canvas site, there's audio you can see of Eleanor, who says to Franklin after his first inauguration, oh, dear Franklin, careful. Those people want you to be a dictator. This dictatorship road not taken of Roosevelt, right? And in The Remains of the Day, this novel on imagined events and imagined characters is saying to us that whether it's all realpolitik and realism, which is what happens in All Quiet on the Western Front, or if it's all liberal idealism and liberal institutionalism, that the appeasers, that had agency in the 30s, that either way, all realism or all idealism, too much of one with no balance and checks on the other, can lead to World War II. That's really the heart of The Remains of the Day.
Well, so I'll just call out again, we are ready for your questions, so please chat them in as you have them. But I have more questions, Jennifer, for you.
Sure.
Can you share a little bit, you referenced, we're in a moment where these issues are very real. There is, the war between Ukraine and Russia. There's right now the issues that are taking place in Israel and Palestine. And these books, they really help to give you kind of context and depth in some ways, because you sit in different people's shoes. And often, that's a really important part of trying to understand international conflict and trying to find ways forward, because you have to be able to sit in multiple people's shoes and find a way where, there may be ways that groups with different perspectives can come to agreements. And I'm just curious, without necessarily even getting into the immediate issues, but just how you see this type of approach to international relations maybe strengthening our capacity to see better as we look at the world and its contents today.
Well, yes, I think at sort of the beginning of your question there, sort of putting ourselves in other people's shoes. I think, a first-class strategist is able to put herself in someone else's shoes. If we could, it's that hubris humility index, right? If we could be humble enough to give our adversaries opinions and views and perspectives as much consideration as our own, then we might make less foolish decisions in our policymaking, right? It doesn't mean we agree with our adversaries, such as appeasement. We don't agree with that, but if we can give it honest thought and consideration of the other perspective, that then we can make more successful policies, right? So I think, the goal here at the Graham School is to become better learners, right? To become lifelong learners, more critical in our thinking of everything we read, to criticize and to have that critical thinking hat on. And I think by looking at other perspectives in other eras, other areas of the world, in different perspectives, we we could understand our world with, maybe a more sophisticated, a more nuanced, a more vivid appreciation of history, and not and to make us more optimistic, in fact, to see that those who preceded us did succeed in many ways. Progress is possible. And then to try to look at our leaders from their shoes too, right? And how we talk about theory and how theories are always in competition with each other. I think of a real world example like, well, since we're talking about the very end of World War II, think about Harry Truman.
Yeah.
He being president April 12th, 1945, right? Eleanor called him to the White House and said, hello, Mr. President. And Harry Truman said, how can I help you now, Eleanor? And she said, how can I help you, Mr. President? You're the one who's in big trouble. And the first thing he did was he hired General George Marshall to be Secretary of State. All of his advisors said, don't do it. He'd be a much better president. He's like your predecessor, and they didn't know it, but like his successor, taller, more handsome, more charismatic, more capable, more experienced. He was more qualified than Truman. Truman wasn't especially qualified to be president. He was sort of a regular senator. Well, he knew at that moment in 1945, he needed a strong partner, right? Stronger, more qualified than him. Fast forward 6 years to, it was April 1951, Truman fires Douglas MacArthur for the same reason he hired General Marshall. He was too good. He was undermining him. He was taking over. So these theories in your leaders' heads change over time. What's right in 1930 might not be right in 1960. So it lets us have a nuanced view.
Yeah, absolutely. One, and it follows actually into the question I'm about to ask from Susan Kettner. From 1991 onwards, she writes, the German government had the policy of Wandel durch Handel, a transformation through trade, in order to draw Russia closer to the West and encourage Russia to take on Western values. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, that policy is now in shreds with all sorts of economic consequences. More generally in Europe, we can see something like a retreat into the nationalism reminiscent of the 19th century. I'll just name recent elections in the Netherlands, and perhaps Brexit before that as examples to add to Susan's question. The question, though, that it finishes with is, was the German policy naive and doomed from the start? Is the default attitude usually nationalism? And so curious for your response to that.
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not an expert on German economic policy, but I am generally familiar with that and that overall concept. Absolutely, in hindsight, the policies to engage Russia well, there are two arguments here. On the one hand, it can be argued, and it is argued by IR scholars, that we should have been engaging Russia since 1991. So choose your date, 1989, 91, 92, when the Soviet Union fell apart, when it was a unipolar world, right? Until sort of mid-20 teens when Russia came back from the dead, right? So at first it was a unipolar world. Now it's a multipolar world, Russia, China, and the US, with Russia being the weakest of the three great powers. So the idea of Germany and others to trade with Russia, right? Russia is basically like a huge gas station, right? Their economy. So the idea of trading with Russia, bringing Russia in hindsight, we see it now as Russia, the aggressor who invaded Ukraine. But at the time, I think that had a lot of agency, right? So I don't know if I would use the word naive. I think in hindsight, we could say that. But at the time, I'm not sure it was wrong or sort of ill-advised. The second part, it's been in the second part about nationalism, and of course in Italy, and of course in France, Le Pen is down, but by no means out. This nationalism really thrives when people are suffering, and that was the point in the Remains of the Day. There was not starvation in Britain, but there was fear of starvation. There was starvation throughout Europe as the European empires broke down during the interwar years. So when times are tough, people can more easily go towards a strong man. And hence what's happening in Italy, we just saw in the Netherlands, throughout Europe, Hungary, and France, in Brexit, we tend to point fingers at the other when times are tough. But whether or not we should have engaged Putin, it's a hot topic. And there is the two arguments. One is that we push NATO too close to Russia, poke the bear. And the other argument is that had we engaged them more economically, rather than sort of tightening our security lines on their border, to what extent would they or would they have not invaded Ukraine? That's sort of going to be forever debated.
Jennifer, we have another question here from Jerry, referencing yesterday's congressional hearings where university presidents were asked to answer moral questions about how students are responding to the current conflict. I feel like it may be an unfair one to pass on entirely to you, so I'll put into the chat, just on my behalf, a wonderful piece written by our president, really laying out the university's approach on this topic, talking about how free expression is a relentless value of the University of Chicago, but it comes with a real responsibility to take seriously other perspectives and to have as much compassion and humility in engaging those perspectives, especially in the most intense times. And the desire for our campus to be a place where we can have open exchange, even in these most intense moments, and that can be civil while being serious and rigorous at the same time. And so I'll pass that on in the chat. I'll maybe ask you the second part of this question from Jerry, and we'll maybe apply this to the kind of big issues that are happening in society right now. Are there other novels or other ways that the novels you've already talked about can really help to illuminate or help us to better think about the big challenges that we're facing right now in global relations? I mean, thinking of the two conflicts, in Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia. I'm also thinking about some of these kind of broader ways of looking at the world. I mean, our relationship, for example, with China, our conception of that relationship, our sense of, otherness. I mean, those things have moved pretty dramatically in the last 20 years from a place of, just thinking of globalization as almost entirely safe, even if not economic questions, to a place where now, many of those ideas are unraveling, and our sense of maybe shared future with a number of places may be changing. And I'm just curious if you could speak to, how novels can play into our understanding and conceptualization of those issues.
Sure. That's a lot. There are three things, I guess. One, the novels. Two, the sort of free speech on campuses. And three, sort of how we see other countries. First of all, the campuses. I would also reference the University of Chicago's Calvin report, Kalven, from 1968. All views welcome. Come prepared and share whatever's on your mind. Write, speak whatever's on your mind, and be prepared for the audience to take you down, right? Like to disagree with you and have a debate. All ideas out there are open, and the universities don't take stands. Universities offer a space for everyone to debate and learn on whatever they want to talk about. In terms of novels, absolutely. So many come to mind. And I think two things. One, to study, if you want to understand the United States, you could read all sorts of literature written by American authors. And to understand other countries and the perspectives of other countries, we can look at authors from other countries, right? Instead of just American authors. So I think that's a really good place to start. And I certainly could have many suggestions that I can share afterwards or share online. But in terms of novels for classes to understand US foreign policy and international relations, next year we're going to look at two different classes. One, we'll look at Chinua Achebe's All Fall Apart, paired with Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. Those two novels we'll use to look at international relations, great power politics in the 20th century. And the other class is going to look at Graham Greene's Quiet American and The Ugly American, and kind of not sort of rehash what we know. I'm not teaching a history class with sort of the names and dates and battles of World War II or the US experience in Vietnam, but more looking at it in the frame of international relations and great power politics and how this complicated world of ours works. And now there was a third part of the question. Sad, I can't remember.
I think you covered it
Okay.
beautifully. I guess I'll have one last question for you, Jennifer. I know we're running out of time. If you could just speak to, as someone who's been deep into IR, how you feel novels and looking at human experience could better inform the whole discipline of international relations. And I'll just give you a random thought, I have. When I used to sit in economics class, this was in the 90s, you look at these theories and what's rational, and then you say, oh yeah, but people don't always behave that way.
Right.
And in the last couple decades, behavioral economics has become a real force and, really changed the way that we look at the whole discipline of economics. And bless the University of Chicago with many Nobel Prizes, coincidentally. But it's really changed the way we look at this topic. And I'm curious, and that's my own thesis for how, like, looking at human experience, because you have these theories of realism, but then when you look at human experience, it quickly changes the idea of linearity that I think is often, embedded in a lot of these theories. So I'm just curious. I mean, we've talked a lot about how literature can help us better understand IR, but I'm curious how it could actually change in your mind the way that IR people look at their own discipline potentially.
That's a very interesting question to kind of switch the lens, right? Like, how can literature enhance how we in the field of IR understand our history, understand international relations? Well, it makes me think bringing it back to the course in the English patient. There are two Canadians who are two of the four protagonists holed up in this villa at the end of World War II. One is a young Canadian nurse, and one is a middle-aged Canadian thief turned spy. And he remembers that he knew the father of this young nurse, and he has a vision of this nurse who's in her early 20s when she was a child in elementary school in Toronto, which was first French before it became British Canada. And he remembers her singing, standing on a chair in her classroom with her hand on her heart. And he thought it was a song about Alfonso, things like, he's trying to remember the song. And later, in a very nonlinear way, it comes out in the book. She was singing Allons, Allons enfants de la patrie. She's singing the Marseillaise. So he thinks it's maybe Alfonso, but it was enfant de la. So in fact, she was pledging allegiance as a child to France. This British Canadian woman from Toronto serving allies in Italy. So by looking at, and again, literature is fiction. So looking at these imagined events, IR scholars who tend to just think maybe more sort of Machiavelli, E.H. Carr, Benedict Anderson, we could see how these theories, how these decisions that have global consequences, in fact, impact individuals and how they even see themselves, how they relate to their communities, how they relate to their families, how they live their lives on a daily basis. That's that Annales school of sort of history from the bottom up that novels shed so much insight into, to restore or to destroy people's faith in nationalities, in national loyalties, how we want to restore and bolster and strengthen that. These novels can help us think through some of those challenges.
We have two final questions here, Jennifer, and 2 minutes for them. Amici Nadili asks, from an IR point of view, what's at the other end of nationalism, a multipolar world, the end of groupings and alliances?
Well, there's idealists who would definitely call for that, right? And that our character, the titular character, the English patient, was a cartographer throughout the 1930s in Northern Africa. He literally tried to map the lines, and there are no lines in the sand. There are 3 million square miles of desert in Northern Africa. His loyalty, his identity had nothing to do with national allegiances, right? His whole identity was wrapped up in the geography. And that's a theme that really comes through. Geography still matters. Despite, nuclear weapons, geography still matters, right? China can't easily stage an amphibious assault on Taiwan. Geography matters, right? So the idea of no national borders, yes, I think that is the antithesis. Although I don't think that's that's sort of a theoretical question for sure. But right, no national identities. There are communities in this world who don't have national identities, right?
Our final question comes from Susan Kentner. The fact that the English patient ends when Kip learns about the 2 atom bombs seems to make a mockery or negate the value of his work as a bomb diffuser. Can you comment on my impression?
Absolutely. It destroys he feels betrayed. It's a profound sense of betrayal. And in many senses, right? He's literally spent his adult life training he has sacrificed, he has risked his life daily to defuse bombs, to prevent bombs from exploding. And this whole idea of explosion and bombs is a huge symbol and theme throughout the novel, how quickly not just an individual's life can end, but the world, right? It was world altering, August 6th and August 9th. So he feels betrayed in many ways. And the question is also asked by Caravaggio, the older Canadian, whether or not the Allies would drop a bomb on a white country. That is absolutely part of the conversation that we'll explore and debate and discuss. That sense of betrayal is profound, and I don't want to do too much spoiler alerts, but it is an abrupt ending. And of course, an author like Ondaatje, he does that on purpose to challenge us. I think we're left with ultimately more questions, right? But maybe more sophisticated questions, more sincere, profound questions rather than answers. This isn't 2 + 2 = 4. This leaves us, as good literature does, we go home and sort of create our own castle with these Lego pieces we're given.
Well,
And
Jennifer,
each reader, unique castle.
You are a Lego master in that regard, and we are truly grateful. You've been able to bring to life a true industry or true, discipline of international relations through the power of literature. And I know for me, I'll just speak individually, reading these novels really does shape the way that you look at the world. And in this current moment, it gives you new tools and lenses that you can ask better questions so that hopefully you can come to better answers. Thank you for being a guide for all of us. Thank you all for joining us. We will follow up. A few of you asked in the chat for the syllabus. So in our follow-up, you'll receive this video and the syllabus for the course. And again, we hope to see many of you in just 8 days' time for a festive gathering at the Gleacher Center, where we look forward to raising a glass to a great autumn of lifelong learning. All right, thank you all. And for those we don't see next week, happy holidays.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.